Morning. I think it's still morning, right? If I took a poll this morning and asked you if you believe that incarceration would have negative effects on a person's ability to earn a living, show by show of hands, how many people would say yes? Okay. Well, it's settled. I can sit down. If it was that easy, I thought I would just, most of us know these figures, but I just thought I'd put it into context. And we see that at year end of 2007, 3,138 black men per 100,000 were incarcerated in state and federal prisons. And for women, it was 150 per 100,000. And just to give a snapshot of how it affects us in terms of race, we see where African Americans are 12% of the general population. They represent 44% of the prison and jail population, and remembering that that most of this 12% are men, and they represent less than about 6% of the population. So I want to present my research showing that individuals who are incarcerated suffer economic and social costs. I'm using, again, data from the Fragile Families Study. We compared unwed fathers who had been incarcerated to those who were not. And we found that the unwed fathers who had been incarcerated had significantly lower employment and earnings. The Fragile Family Study, you've heard Dr. Weaver talk about it earlier this morning, so I won't go into a great deal of detail. Joint effort by Princeton and Columbia, tracking a cohort of children born between 1998 and 2000. Data from for this presentation is from the second wave collected 1 year after the birth of a child. And these are the cities where data were collected for fragile families. In the baseline, 4,898 mothers, 3,830 fathers completed the baseline survey. We didn't lose that many in the follow-up. Since we limited our study to unwed fathers, there was a small amount of married fathers in the sample, but in order to reduce some of the heterogeneity, we dropped the married fathers, and we kept the unwed mothers and unwed fathers. Bruce Weston found, using the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, found incarcerated reduced wage rates by 16%. This is some of the previous research. An earlier study by Freeman, also using NLSY, found incarceration reduced work probability by 25 to 30%. Braga found moderate and short-term effects on annual earnings and employment. And Kling, using data from Florida, found no negative effects of incarceration. But it seems a no-brainer that incarceration should have negative effects on an individual's labor market outcomes. There are gaps in work history. Early incarceration interrupts schooling. Forfeiture of job training opportunities. People build human capital by learning different skills while they're working. Exposure to criminogenic environments. Convictions are difficult to hide. They follow you. And there are reduced employment opportunities because there are some places you can't work if you have a criminal record. So we had two groups of fathers, some who had been incarcerated, some who were not. We used a retrospective measure of incarceration and post-incarceration measures of employment and earnings, and we analyzed the association between incarceration and their work histories. Most studies, one advantage of the Fragile Families data, it contained controls that were not available in other studies, such as physical and mental health measures, drug and alcohol use and problems, and relationship with biological fathers. We added an instrumental variable, state incarcerations by race. These variables are exogenous and help to account for the variation in the main independent variable. It's difficult to document the effects of incarceration on earnings unless you have pre-post data, and it's just not available. So you have to come up with these creative ideas in terms of using instrumental variables to try to suggest a causal link and satisfy economists. Excuse me. So this is the descriptive statistics from my sample. Now, there were two samples here. There's the mother sample of 3,290 people, and then it was fathers who were sampled. Some of the fathers were not available, so we asked questions of the mother that we could use in our analysis. And what we wanted to demonstrate here is that and these are questions about the father's education, that there wasn't much difference between the father sample and the mother sample. Yet there was differences between the people the men who had been incarcerated. They were more likely to be black, and they had, this is less than high school education, and I did it again. And they had less education. Now, this was, it also showed that in our two samples that the probability of the father working last week were pretty much the same. However, the fathers who had been incarcerated were 58% of those fathers worked the week before the data collection, compared to 83% of those who had never been incarcerated. So they did have less employment, and they also earned less, $16,000 to $24,525. And they worked less weeks. So we see there are differences in the ever incarcerated and the never incarcerated fathers. So we did a logistic regression on the whether or not the father had worked, and after adding controls, we still found that that fathers who had been incarcerated were 57% as likely to have worked as those who had not been incarcerated. And the black fathers were 41% as likely to have worked as the white fathers in the sample. Okay, this is our regression analysis for earnings and weeks work, hours work, and off-the-book earnings. Fathers who had been incarcerated made 28% less than fathers who had not been incarcerated. They worked 3.6 weeks less than fathers who had not been incarcerated. They were more likely to earn off-the-book earnings than the fathers who were not incarcerated, and more likely to make money with underground earnings. Okay, now I'm going to shift to the relational part of my study. And one reason we're concerned about that, obviously, because single-family households with children under 18, and that's in all races, and particularly among blacks, are much more likely to be poor. So to the degree to which incarceration might affect family formation would lead to an increase in single-family households. Between 1968 and 2003, the percentage of all Americans, children under age 18, living in a single mother household more than doubled. The percentage of black children under age 18 also grew from 29% to 50%. Now, this is at the same time that the incarceration rate is going up. And I don't have any proof that the incarceration rate actually was connected to that, but it's a parallel. And William Julius Woodson had attributed the erosion in marriage among African Americans to a reduction in the pool of marriageable men. Eden and others found that women were reluctant to marry men with questionable labor market potential. And to the extent that incarceration may erode labor market potential, it may also help to erode the potential of incarcerated men to form families. So again, using data collected in the first two cities of fragile families, a sample of 656 mothers and 524 fathers, we found that 22% of the men who had been incarcerated were married, and at a year after the birth of the child, and 42% were of those who had never been incarcerated were married. So there was no significant difference in the percentage of the fathers who had been incarcerated who were cohabiting with their mother of the child than the fathers who were never incarcerated. But just 22% of the fathers who were incarcerated were married. Fathers who had been incarcerated were 30% as likely to be married as fathers who were never incarcerated, and fathers who had been incarcerated were 53% as likely to be cohabiting with the mother as those who were never incarcerated. Okay, that's my meager attempt to show statistically that there is a connection between incarceration and labor market outcomes and relationships. And in closing, I would like to read to you an essay, or not an essay, but an op-ed piece that I had published in the Washington Examiner, which is my statement of where I am on this issue. One measure of the Barack Obama era, if not the Obama administration, will be steps taken to address disproportionate involvement of people of color in the criminal justice system, which is arguably the most pressing civil rights issue facing African Americans and Latinos in the United States today. African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, but comprise more than a third of the prison population. Keeping in mind that the vast majority of those incarcerated are African American males, who make up less than 7% of the population. Many of the challenges facing African Americans, health disparities, poor education, and economic outcomes, and limited family formation, either lead to, stem from, or in some way connected to the fact that so many African Americans are involved with the criminal justice system. We have become inured to the incredible loss of human capital that occurs on a daily basis, as getting arrested and locked up behind bars have become so common to the experience of young African American males. More than 1 in 10 black males aged 25 to 34 are incarcerated in federal, state, and local jails on a given day. And researchers estimate that approximately 27% of African American males will spend some time of their lives behind bars. The Sentencing Project tells us that 1 in 7 African males is barred from voting because of felony conviction, and as many as 3 in 10 in the next generation of African American males may lose their right to vote. With a Democratic President, Barack Obama, and significant majorities in both houses of Congress, there is a renewed opportunity to revisit some of the punitive policies that were part of the get tough on crime approach of the conservative era. Fair access to legal services and drug treatment should be common practice. The federal government should do all it can to prevent young people from getting entangled in the criminal justice system, particularly young people who are born into dysfunctional environments. Yet funds for juvenile delinquency prevention programs have all but disappeared through the last 30 years of conservative policies. The federal and state governments should address the disproportionate use of criminal sanctions by revisiting laws and policies that stimulate disproportionate arrests, convictions, and sentences, by treating drug use and abuse as a public health issue rather than purely criminal conduct, and by providing adequate services and education for all its citizens, and by ensuring that an encounter with the criminal justice system does not become a life sentence. Disproportionate involvement with the criminal justice system continues to wreak havoc in communities of color and arguably infringes on the civil rights of African Americans. As much as former President Bill Clinton will be remembered as a friend to African Americans, he presided over the largest growth in incarceration in the nation's history. President Obama must do better. If there are any issues in need of change, how we use criminal sanctions is certainly high among them. Thank you.